Okay. Today, my guest is Professor Devinney. I will keep my introduction short to maximize our time with him. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Timothy as a person, Professor Devinney as a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and finally as a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I'll skip many of his accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Timothy is a fellow of the AIB, the Academy of Social Sciences, the Rockefeller Foundation, Australia, New Zealand Academy of Management, and the Royal Society of Arts. He has received AOM's Impact Practice Award for the influence of his scholarship on management practice and policy, the Global Community Award, as well as the Alexander von Humboldt Award. He has served as the chair of IM Division, head of the Global Strategy Interest Group of the SMS. He was the co-editor of Academy of Management Perspectives, Advances in International Management Series, the founding editor of Annals in Social Responsibility, Foundations and Trends in International Business and Management. He is also the director and editor of International Business and Management Network and Sustainability Research and Policy Network of the SSRN. I have to put at least in front of the next set of numbers. Professor Devinney has authored or co-authored at least a dozen books, 100 refereed articles, presented papers and addresses at more than 200 universities in conferences over the last decade. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
So the first question always is, what did you want to become when you were a child?
To be honest, I wanted to become a Supreme Court justice. So it was, I was always fascinated by law and history. And that was really kind of the thing I saw myself sort of kind of in that role.
Where were you born?
I was born in Pittsburgh.
Huh. Can you pinpoint the earliest moment of awareness between international and domestic?
Well, I grew up in a very poor inner city. And for me, foreign was what was across the bridge. So it was a very different type of environment in that regard. But I would probably say that going through high school, I was very fascinated by things outside, different languages, different cultures, and things of that nature. So I would probably say it was my high school experience that probably started that.
Your CV is pages and pages long. What is something that is not on your CV that's of interest to people? Something unexpected.
Well, I don't think that there's that much that's unexpected. It's probably, the life of a typical boring academic. But over the years, I've actually been quite involved with nonprofit organizations. So this goes back to doing things like working disaster relief, and currently where I sit on the boards of several charities. So I've always been involved in that, and part of that I think also comes from my background, and that is that coming from a very deprived part of an inner city in the United States, I mean, I always understood the limitations of kind of the normal progression. If I didn't have people who helped me and sought me out, God only knows where I would have been. So I tended to spend quite a bit of time on those sorts of things. To where I'm the deputy chair of one organization that I've now been involved with for many years. And it also leads over to a lot of the things that I do in general. And I have done this, in not just in the United States and the United Kingdom and in Australia, but involved with various groups in Asia and Europe, Eastern Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, for example.
Interesting. If you stop doing what you're doing today, what would be your second best alternative career path?
Well, this is another sort of kind of bizarre bit. And that is that I never applied to a PhD program. It was never my intention to get a PhD. I was at Carnegie Mellon, and I had to, because I had no money, my family had no money. I had to work to get through university, and so I was a research assistant to many different people. I worked with Herb Simon. I worked with this guy John Carroll. I worked with John Payne. I worked with many of the Carnegie psychologists because I was in psychology and applied mathematics. And it was my intention, in fact, to get a JD MBA degree. And when I went to the University of Chicago, I just went to visit. So I drove up to Chicago, and apparently what had happened was the people at Carnegie talked to the people at Chicago, and so there were a number of people, Hilla Einhorn being the most prominent, who basically said, "Well, look, why don't you come and join the PhD program? You have to give up on the law degree, but you join the PhD program. We give you a scholarship. We give you a stipend, and if you don't like it, in 2 years or so, you can take an MBA and you can leave." So I actually never applied to the PhD program. I was admitted to it, but I never applied to it.
Interesting. Let's talk about regrets. What is one thing you wish you would have done that you didn't?
Generally, I don't have regrets. I mean, I've always been kind of a forward-looking things. I mean, but I would actually say, in a very odd way, probably getting the PhD might be a regret, because in some regards, getting a PhD constrains you once you reach a certain age, in terms of your career path options. So in that regard, I guess I started my PhD when I was 20 years old. So I didn't, I started very quickly. I graduated university very quickly, and I went into the PhD virtually immediately. So I guess in that sense, I never really had the chance to do other stupid things other than the academically stupid things I've done over. So I didn't really kind of have those other types of experiences in my 20s. I had them later on in life, maybe, but not in my 20s.
Interesting. What's the best advice you received so far?
Well, I guess the probably the singularly most useful advice was to listen and not be convinced. And this, I guess, I partially got when I was at Carnegie, but I certainly got when I was in Chicago. And that is that academic debate is good. Leave your emotion out of it. That causes you in some ways to be harsh at times, because even though you might not be emotional about the argument you're making, you may be making it to somebody who doesn't quite have that restraint. So I've always been skeptical. I've always been questioning. I've never assumed in any way, shape, or form that I know anything. So it's always been this idea to question everything.
Now let's switch gears towards your research and IB research in general. And I start this segment with usually you're stranded in a pub. There are people, locals, who are curious about you, and you're explaining your research to them in layman's terms. How do you explain your research, and why is your research important?
Well, the big problem I have is I tend to work across a whole range of different areas. So it's not like I'm a bit of a one-trick pony. I'm more of a jack of all trades and master of none. But I would guess that the primary thing that I tell people is that what my research really focuses on is the why certain things happen. In other words, why are organizations structured the way they are? Why do people behave the way they behave? Why do managers behave the way they behave? So in some sense, I'm concerned about behavior. It doesn't matter whether it's the behavior of an individual buying a beer in a bar, how the bar is structured, or what the bartender does to make you make the sorts of decisions about what it is that you might want from the menu. So ultimately, I'm concerned about behavior, and why behaviors occur, when in fact those behaviors don't necessarily follow very simple models, and it requires a bit of thinking to understand why there's a gap between what people think they're doing and what they ultimately are doing.
This is actually quite interesting because what you're saying is that you're giving a great example. A person working in different areas, if you go to an AA meeting versus if you go to an SMS meeting or AOM meeting, AIB meeting, you're talking to different audience. And a person like you, and there are a couple of people like you who are, I don't want to say jack of all trades, but they work in diverse areas. You should be able to communicate with many different types of people
Mhm.
equally effectively. Um, but talking about IB research in particular, what are the few omitted variables or underutilized variables, concepts in IB?
Well, I honestly think that it's probably the manager, um, or the politician. Um, we can go back to Ira Roney's early work, where he kind of focused on managers, but he was doing that work in the 1960s when, in fact, with the theory of the firm and other things, there was a focus on kind of the decision making structures, of in organizations. But long before people were talking about, managers, you can go back and look in some of my book publications and, book chapter publications, or even some, old presentations where I was asking the question, who makes the decisions here? Why, if the managers don't matter, then why are we paying them so much money? If the managers don't matter, why do we survey them and ask them questions about their organizations? Because they're simply automatons who are stuck within some sort of kind of algorithmic system. So in that sense, there is this issue of kind of, do the managers matter? And I was talking about that 20 years ago, before there was behavioral strategy, and before there was the behavioral, um, discussions within a lot of areas of management. So in that sense, the decision rules of the managers matter. More recently, we worked on a number of papers on populism, and we haven't talked about populism in quite the same way everybody else has. Basically, we asked the question of, what does this really imply about the underlying theoretical structures we have? And the answer is, it tears apart, a lot of the models of environmental risk, for example, environmental political, risk. Because if you look at the most of the academic studies, certainly within international business, they're very institutionalist. What they say is, they say, the institutions matter, and so they have all these measures for institutions. But within political science, there's a statement that says personnel is policy, and it actually is the people running the institutions that matter. And if you believe that the people running the institutions matter, then you would be very concerned about these sort of individuals who become cabinet secretaries or ministers in government, or become prime ministers or presidents. If there is no political agency amongst those individuals, then it doesn't really matter who's in the job. But certainly in the United States, we've seen it does matter who's in the job. And I think that our models really abstract from this. So overall, I would say that really the big missing variable in international business are the people, are kind of the fallible human beings, but not in the way that people who talk about micro foundations or talk about behavioral strategy think about them. It really comes down to who those individuals are, what their decision rules are, and what constraints the environment puts on them in terms of the nature of the institutional constraints.
I will come back to creativity in scholarship and how do you come up with these interesting papers? But I want to follow up on the earlier argument. If the next phase of IB is managers and politicians or the humans in institutions. What is overly studied? What is something that we should not spend too much time on IB anymore?
Well, I think we've beaten certain horses to death. I think we've beaten internalization theory to death. I think we've beaten transaction cost economics to death. I think we have wasted probably 15 to 20 years on a lot of studies of culture using very poor measures of culture. And I think that we've wasted enormous amounts of times on internationalization process theory, where nobody really knows what in God's name internationalization process theory is, other than internationalization process theory is about the process of internationalization. So it's tautological. So I think that there are other gaps in what it is that we do. But the biggest problem, I think, is that institutionally, people's careers are linked to the historic work that's being done. There's a lot of money and reputation associated with maintaining legacies. But ultimately you have to discard old theories. They were great in their time, but unless they are really grand theories of everything, which we don't have in the social sciences, I think it's important that you really make big breaks with in theoretical structures. But the journals and the systems always require you to anchor what it is that you're doing in existing theory. And it's a bit of an albatross around the necks of science, to be honest.
I mean, you're talking about some sort of an evolution over time, and you're talking about the culture of IB scholars evolving or changing across decades. What are we losing, or what are we gaining along this evolutionary path?
Well, I think that we're in a little bit of a death spiral, to be honest. So I'll probably be a bit, because the other aspect of this is I did not study international business. I was at UCLA. I was actually in economics, and it was Jose De La Torre and a few other people who sort of said, "Oh, you should really work in strategy and international business." People like Bruce Kogut and a number of other people, and so I did not. I think the first IB conference I attended was in 1997, and by 2001 I had actually run the conference. But the thing I think which was telling there was the first paper I ever wrote in IB basically went after the Bartlett-Goschel framework and said it makes no sense whatsoever. It actually, and if you read that paper in Organization Science, it basically says this doesn't make any sense. Okay, it actually, if you believe everything that Bartlett and Goschel tell you in that international global integration local responsiveness framework, you don't get the answers they say. And the irony of that, of course, is that stuff is still usually cited, and people use it all the time. But it is actually fatally flawed. It simply is not right. It is logically inconsistent. And it fails kind of the basic Popperian law, kind of logical consistency associated with theoretical structures. So I think that there are issues related to what it is that we do, where we don't necessarily want to, or the system doesn't allow us to make radical breaks with the way in which we think about problems.
And the audience will recognize in Jean-Francois Hénard's interview, he also touched on these topics, on this question. So my question to you is, where do you see the IB research in the next 5 to 10 years? What is the most lucrative field to enter as a junior faculty or as a student?
Well, it depends on what you're trying to achieve. Okay, and to be honest, I would say, Jean-Francois, to his credit, if you look at a number of the papers that he has written, certainly in the last 10 years, they have been highly, highly, highly critical of the logical structures of existing ideas. And they're well structured, they're very, very good that way. So I'm not the only one that's sort of kind of making those viewpoints. But I think it depends on what you want to do as a scholar. If you want to increase your citations, very simple, work on international entrepreneurship. You can just crank out the papers, you can crank out the stuff, you'll get the citations. There are lots of areas that are kind of hot topics. I don't necessarily think that they're very fruitful from a scientific standpoint. And in a sense, what we need to do is that we need to really work on things which materially question, let's say, existing structures, theoretical structures that we have begged, borrowed, and stolen over time. We need to really look at the outliers, not look for the kind of gross consistencies that we tend to see. Those are pretty obvious. Real science, real breakthroughs come from finding outliers and looking at those outliers and saying, that's not telling me what I think I should be seeing, but it is true. And then the question is, what do you do to sort of kind of make the theoretical structures better? And sometimes you have to just simply throw out the history and start from first principles and ask yourself the question, if I didn't read anything and I came at this sort of as a naive but very intelligent scholar, how would I build this if I could build it from scratch again? And if the answer is I would build it very differently from the way in which it has been built, then give it a go and try and test that against the existing structures.
This has been very helpful. I mean, I would normally ask, how do you come up with these creative ideas? And you're giving the direction, finding the outliers, and you're giving advice. Among the skills that are needed to be successful, especially for the new generation of scholars, what should they be building their career on? What are the type of resources, capabilities that they need to be gathering?
Well, I think that there are a number of different ones. The first thing I would say is that people have to read. And by that, I mean they have to read very broadly. In the sense that you go back and you sort of say, well, look, my background is very broad. I read history, I look at literature, I read outside my field all the time. And it's, in fact, I probably read more outside my field than I do read inside my field. So you have to really look for ideas in really out of the way places. The second thing is that you need to be technically competent. And I think this is something where I think we have ultimately missed the boat. And we've missed the boat in the sense that we tend to kind of utilize package-based models. So everybody and their dog now starts doing multi-level models. And the question was, well, why weren't they doing it before? The answer was they were doing it before. I was actually running multi-level models back in the 1980s. The difference was I was programming it up in SAS. Now, anybody who has access to a canned program can do it. And so what you really need is you really need that very fundamental set of capabilities. You need to know how to program. You need to know the fundamental statistics. You need to have kind of a multiplicity of ways of doing things. Recently, for example, I published 4 or 5 papers, maybe more, I don't know, using text-based algorithms. That started to become much more popular. But I have some papers now I'm working on where we have literally gone out and not manually, but using computer systems, gone out and trawled through the internet and looked through all the firm's filings and the firm's PR and everything like that. And the machines read these millions and millions and millions of documents. You can't kind of rely on 13 semi-structured interviews and think that you're going to develop substantive science. Yeah, you might find some outliers, but you're not really going to find substantive science. And to be able to compete against what's being done in other fields, even in the social sciences, where there's been a lot of sophistication in terms of the utilization of AI systems and other things. I think you're just going to have those skills. It's just not possible, I think, to advance things. That's where my statement about kind of a bit of a death spiral kind of comes into things, and that is that methodologically, when you borrow methodologies rather than develop methodologies, you are always going to be 5 to 10 years behind the times.
True.
So that's the other thing. And then the third thing is, I think you have to have an influence strategy. You have to actually understand who it is you're trying to communicate with, and have a real clear idea of how it is you're going to influence them. It isn't enough to just write something and expect people to read it. If you write something, the odds are 99.99999% that nobody will read it. It doesn't matter whether it's a journal article, doesn't matter whether it's a blog, doesn't matter whether it's a tweet. Most people will ignore it. Most of that stuff just disappears. So you have to have a very clear idea of who it is that you're trying to influence, and have a really clear understanding of how it is that you get to those people. And I think that our fields have not been very good at doing this. We don't have influence on policy. I mean, Brexit, for example, occurred in the United Kingdom with zero input from business school academics, zero input. The current Brexit trade negotiations occurred with zero input from business academics. Okay, it was all done outside. So clearly there is a lack of influence in our field that has bedeviled it, I think, for many years.
What is your suggestion for the solution of this lack of influence problem?
Yeah, it really comes down to sort of kind of who it is that you might be able to talk to. I'll give an example of this, and it is that you could write all the academic articles that you want, okay? And if you put one article in Harvard Business Review or one article in the Financial Times, you would be surprised at how many people talk to you. The other aspect of this is that if you're trying, for example, to influence government is not influenced by academic research, despite everything that people might say about following the science. For example, the UK Parliament, the library of the UK Parliament does not have journal subscriptions. All right. How does it get its information? It gets its information through think tanks. It gets its information through other means. And what you have to do is you have to figure out what those other means are. And sometimes those other means are literally getting in the face of agents of influence, of getting noticed by the Financial Times writers, getting noticed by people in think tanks, getting noticed by individuals who are, let's say, key administrators in policy. And that works for corporations as well. You don't get to the CEO by going to the CEO. You don't get to the board of directors by going to the board of directors, unless you're some really kind of fancy professor at a very well-known place. You get there by, for example, working your way through the middle managers, and inviting them to your class to give talks, having them meet with you and talk about your research, and on and on and on. So it's a long and hard process. It's not something in which there's an easy solution to.
You've seen many students, you've seen many papers as an editor. What are the top one or two problems that IB scholars usually make? What is the thing to avoid?
Well, I guess the question is in terms of what? I mean, there's an infinite number of mistakes. I think that probably the biggest weakness I see in terms of things is that people tend to be too tightly compartmentalized. They don't situate their research in larger questions. And you can sort of see this in the nature of the way in which they write. So in terms of sort of kind of the nature of their writing, they they tend to be very stylized. You know, so in that sense, they don't necessarily, you know, do that well. So I would say probably one of the biggest mistakes is just related to writing style, situating their work effectively in bigger questions rather than kind of very small and narrow questions, unless it really is a very small and narrow thing. In other words, you can't advance a whole field by just kind of picking away at tiny little things. The second aspect of it is I think that people believe their data. And you know, the thing I think people have to recognize is that you cannot prove anything with a single study. So when people sort of say, "Oh, my hypothesis was confirmed," the answer is no, it wasn't. You now have an updated Bayesian posterior probability as to the validity of your idea. That's all you have. You know, so it doesn't matter whether you have 10,000 firms. You know, the question is does it hold for 20,000 firms? Does it hold for 20,000 firms or 10,000 firms or 500 firms from another population sample? I think people honestly believe their data. They really truly do. And Richard Feynman was really good in this regard, and that is, he says, you know, there are two things that really matter in terms of science, and that is that the theories of today won't be the theories of tomorrow, because you've advanced, right? And the second is that you can't prove anything, right? There's no absolute ability to prove things, and so people use the term confirm, but the reality is that they're not really confirming either, and they do, I think, falsely believe that they actually have generated substantively more knowledge than they really have in terms of the nature of the work they're doing.
Thank you. And the last question is, what is one question that I should have asked you but didn't?
I honestly don't know. I mean, it's your interview, not my interview in that sense. I guess that the one thing that is sort of kind of bothered me over a number of years, is whether the academic university structure and the way in which we do scholarship, generally speaking, in business schools, so it could be IB, but it could be business schools in general, whether that is actually really appropriate. You know, that the biggest influence seems to be coming from consulting firms. It seems to be coming from specialist think tanks. As I said, for example, with respect to Brexit, the government got all of its information fundamentally from consultancies and think tanks. It didn't get them from people at universities. And therefore, you have this kind of interesting aspect of this. And it says, you know, are we really the right place to do the things that we are charged with doing? And I'm not convinced now that, you know, that the university, which might have been very effective in the 20th century for doing a lot of this, is going to be effective in the 21st century for doing it. And we're going to have to really think long and hard about, you know, the nature of how it is that we do the things that we do.
Thank you so much for this splendid interview. I learned a lot. I'm sure the audience will agree with me. Thank you so much for your time. It was great.
Thank you.